Paul Morphy was an American chess player who lived a tragically short life of 47 years from 1837 to 1884. His chess career is often described as meteoric because of its relatively short but flashing brilliant span. His genius over the chessboard knew no equal during his prime, but he was troubled later in life with mental issues and suffered from depression. Thus, Paul Morphy is often referred to as the pride and sorrow of chess. Paul Morphy played in the chess era known as the Romantic Age, which was known for its swashbuckling and aesthetically beautiful style, if often technically unsound. Very soon after the Romantic Age, the first official world chess champion, Wilhelm Steinitz, ushered in the Classical Age, wherein the principles and science of chess came to the forefront. Morphy didn't usher in the Romantic Age all by himself, but he was its finest shining example, whose light inspires people to this very day in the computer/information age. I recently read a book on chess history that I found in my local library called The World of Chess by Anthony Sadie and Norman Lessing. It was a fascinating read and an interesting snapshot of history, because it was published in 1974, when the world was still sizzling hot with Bobby Fischer fever. If you can get your hands on it, I would highly recommend it, because it is a nice summary of the game, the history, and the greats who played it. Now, when that book wrote its section on Paul Morphy, it said, and I quote, "To say, as many have, that he was the greatest chess player of all time is patently nonsense. Any of the scorers of today's top masters would easily beat Morphy by virtue of the decades of accumulated chess knowledge." Now, that kind of stuck with me, because as I said, this book comes from the 70s, and I think that the farther back history goes, the hazier our image of it becomes. In other words, if people already thought that the idea that Morphy was the best chess player was preposterous in 1974, then it would be assumed that people today wouldn't even give it a second thought. But the thing is, many people still do give it thought. Many people still do consider Morphy the single greatest chess player of all time. I think one of the reasons for this is one of the best features of the game of chess, which is its ever-pristine state. People have a natural tendency to center around, or a natural bias towards what is modern and what is current. We tend to think that because something happened recently, it is something of a representation of the best that has ever been. After all, it builds on what was built before. Whenever I hear someone talk about how LeBron James is the best basketball player ever, it seems terribly short-sighted for a person who clearly remembers the Michael Jordan era. And still, others older than me can remember when Wilt Chamberlain simply couldn't be stopped. If I ask, what was the best Super Bowl ever? A Giants fan would tell me one thing, then a Steelers fan would tell me another, a Dolphins fan another, and a Packers fan another. Who is right? Well, to each their own, but the further back you go, the less people can remember it clearly and carry on the legacy of the mark it left on their heart. Maybe Lawrence Taylor was the fiercest linebacker to ever put on a jersey. Maybe it was Jack Lambert. Maybe it was Dick Butkus. Or maybe it was clearly another guy who simply played in an era well before my own. Unfortunately, I've never seen their deeds, great though they may have been. Now, let's talk about chess. Thanks to the nature of the game and its notation, we know exactly what past players' great deeds were. We know exactly what decisions they made, and we know exactly the outcome of those decisions, even if the game was played 2 weeks ago, even if it was played several centuries ago. Now, of course, it is incumbent on the observer to fully realize the brilliance of the moves played in those games, but they're always there, waiting to be discovered. And that's where Paul Morphy truly shines. I've studied the games of numerous grandmasters and champions over the years, and I've not found one whose clear, intuitive style and aesthetic beauty are as enjoyable and instructive to study as Morphy. And that's the crux of the debate when it comes to discussing who is the greatest of all time. Because there are players, unlike Morphy, who were officially crowned world champion, and there are players who have reigned for a much longer time, players with a far greater list of tournament victories, players who maintained an aura of invincibility, and players with a far greater number of games and wins over their chess careers. So, how could Morphy possibly be considered the greatest? Why does his name keep entering the debate well over a century after his death? Well, his greatest claim to fame is his now legendary journey to Europe in 1858 to challenge the great European chess masters. Now, it's important to note that in Morphy's time, like now, American chess was simply not on the same level as European chess. America has produced an occasional chess genius who could challenge Europe's dominance, but well before the onset of the Soviet chess school, Europe had already established a rich history of chess through its famous coffee houses and cafes, like the Café de la Régence, which fostered greats like Philidor and La Bourdonnais, among others. So as you can imagine, most of the players in Europe didn't think much of this American relative newcomer's chances against their finest players. And so that's why, as you can also imagine, Morphy cemented his name in chess history when he not only defeated every great master he played, but he beat them all soundly, leaving no doubt as to who was the world's best. His most famous victories came over such masters as Harrwitz, Lowenthal, and especially the legendary Adolf Anderssen, who is widely considered the world's best player prior to and after Morphy's brief run. Actually, Anderssen's biggest competition for that title, and the only negative on Morphy's great European trip, was Howard Staunton, who has also cemented his name as an all-time great chess master, but has also drawn criticism for famously avoiding an open match with Morphy. I can't overstate just how profound was the impact of Morphy's trip. Not only did he prove his mastery over his contemporaries, many of the games he played are still being taught and shown as some of the best and most famous games ever played. One example of which was his game against the Duke of Brunswick and the Count Isouard called the Opera Game, as it was played during an opera. And that's another aspect of Morphy's trip that is often forgotten in the mists of time. Morphy was meeting not only dukes, counts, but also princes, and he even had a private audience with Queen Victoria herself. Returning to America in triumph, he met other influential people, mayors, university presidents, politicians. Sadly, all this success over the chessboard did little to prevent Morphy from adopting the common belief of his time that chess players weren't real professionals, but actually not much more than mere gamblers. He soon stopped playing chess competitively to pursue an ultimately failed law practice. He lived his remaining life in relative idleness thanks to his family's wealth, and died young from a stroke. To redress his criticisms, he was not the longest reigning champion, he didn't have the largest number of tournament victories, and he played chess in an era before theory was formalized, before they had invented the wheel, so to speak. But there's a funny thing about living in the age of the wheel. If I were to show an image of obsolete technology, like this, or this, or this, our first instinct is to typically laugh at how backwards it seems in relation to what is current. We are living in an age where absolute potsers will log on to chess forums and laugh at the mistakes of super GMs and brag about how they knew, obviously, what the GMs playing the game, the GMs commentating the game, and the supercomputers analyzing the game as it's happening failed to notice. Living in the age of the wheel, we tend to say, well, yeah, of course we should use wheels. Everybody knows that. But as we say that, we forget the sacrifices, and blood, and sweat, and that moment of epiphany it took to make that first wheel. In actuality, Paul Morphy's chess was well ahead of its time, largely due to his undeniably genius intuition and resourcefulness over the board, completely unassisted by today's modern tools like computers, textbooks, and coaching. That, to me, is what makes a chess player worth remembering. With the advent of the modern era of scientific rules, high-stakes financial investment, and advertising, it brought about an interesting dichotomy. Is it more important to win or to create beauty over the board? Obviously, some will say winning, some will say beauty, and of course, they're both good points and very important. After all, we play games to win them. Our primary motivation for entering a competition is to win. Yet, on the other hand, imagine watching from start to finish a 10-round boxing match where both boxers are so scared of getting countered that they don't throw a punch the whole match. The contest becomes a waste of time for everyone. Nobody cares who wins. Morphy answers the bell on both counts. Not only are his games often very beautifully played aesthetic masterpieces, his winning percentage is unprecedented. According to ChessGames.com, a great website and chess database, Morphy's winning percentage is a whopping 84.6%, well ahead of other candidates for greatest of all time like Capablanca, Fischer, and Kasparov. Now, of course, even as we must take into consideration the limited communication and transportation of Morphy's time, it is still quite impressive given that Morphy did dive into the deep end of the competition pool for his era, and when strong competition couldn't be found, he would often give odds, winning several games starting off down a full rook. Going back to the book I referenced earlier, where the authors of the Fischer era dismissed Morphy as unable to compete with modern players, well, Fischer himself disagreed with that. He even said that Morphy had the talent to beat any player of any age if given time to study modern theories and ideas, and I couldn't agree more. Don't let the shroud of history cover your eyes. A chess player should be judged by their chess games. Any chess book or article discussing the best of all time will try and talk about chess and present their case, and it's always a matter of subjective perspective, and of course this video is no exception. But there is a reason Morphy's name has never left the discussion, no matter how long the years grow. It is not really up to the subjective opinion of the author discussing Morphy. His genius was written over the chessboard and remains for the world's enjoyment and fascination. I encourage you, see Paul Morphy's games for yourself and understand why he was the best chess player of all time.